Hey everyone, welcome back to the Worldview Minute. This is going to be our last episode in which we unpack a Christian view of the state. And I know that even though we've spent actually the most episodes on this one, we still have just scratched the surface of this topic. And today I want to lay out for you what I have termed a sanctified state. And this is pitched pretty much as a rejection of what I have called a form of Christian secularism, which views that the state should remain religiously neutral, that it shouldn't recognize the Christian God, which a lot of Baptists, my fellow Baptists, have endorsed, which I think is the wrong way to go. And then on the other side of that equation, what I'm going to call Christian nationalism, while recognizing that there is a lot of various views within that very broad umbrella, but I'm going to define it just for this episode as Christian nationalism being some form of a state established church. Note, I am not saying a state established religion, because I think that is unavoidable. Secularism is a religion, but a state established church I want to reject. So within those two realms that seem to be the two main warring factions on so much of our political theory dialogue as Christians today, I want to offer a uniquely Baptistic, and really, I don't even think it's only Baptistic, but something that makes my Baptist brothers far more comfortable than so-called Christian nationalism, and what is really a putting together of what we have seen so far as to what does the Bible say about the state and its relationship to the church and its relationship to society. Because we know, as we look around in society right now, secularism is failing. We also know, as we look back in world history, atheistic secular states in the last 100+ years have been the most oppressive and the worst when it comes to things like human rights. And that is only natural. Ideas have consequences. If you reject a God who gives us God-given rights, then the state becomes God and the state can do whatever it wants. And so whether it's communist China, the USSR, or Nazi Germany, when you reject God, the state becomes a beast. And so how do we put together a political philosophy, again, just an introduction to a political philosophy, governing philosophy, as Christians from the Bible that avoids the errors of secularism, where the God becomes the state, or the errors of, we can even go back in history where the state and the church were melded too much together, or in Roman Catholic thought where the state, or where the church ruled over the state. So I want to offer 5 points today, 5 points in summary of what is a Christian view of the state, what is a sanctified state. And at the beginning, we want to say that a sanctified state is, well, a state that is set aside to service to God. So 5 points today. Number 1, we have to recognize that God has established distinct spheres, and those spheres are equal to one another. Right? Think about this very, very carefully when we go back to that episode about sphere sovereignty, that God has ordained distinct spheres or governing structures in life. In the home, it's the father and the parents, the father, the husband at the head, parents over their children. That is a God-ordained family government, governing structure. In the church, we have elders. We have checks and balances on the elders through the congregation. But we have a God-ordained governing structure there. In the state, we have governing authorities there as well. All of those 3 different spheres are all God-ordained. They're distinct with specific ministries and roles in life, and they're all equal. The state is not over the church and the family. The church is not over the state. The family is not over the church or the state. They are all equal, and God is above them all through Christ. And so as we look at the biblical testimony about this, God has ordained these authorities, and he's commanded submission in the home, he's commanded submission in the state, he has commanded submission in the church, because all of these are delegated and derived authority structures that are ultimately accountable to God. That is, if there is no God above that authority, then there is no authority in that sphere. All men are equal. The only way that any individual gets authority is if God grants that individual the authority, and that naturally limits it. So principle number 1 is that God has established distinct spheres with specific ministries and roles, and that those spheres are equal to one another underneath God's sovereign authority mediated by the Son. Second, flowing naturally from that, that means that the state is under the authority of God. So right here, we have to rule out what we could call a Christian form of secularism, that the state is somehow devoid or separated from recognizing God. We should also rule out what some are calling Christian theism, but it's really a Christian deism, where we recognize some vague deity out there, but he doesn't really have any active role in the governing process. Right? These are sub-biblical. These are not what the Bible teaches. The state is God's servant, Romans 13. Right? He is accountable to God. God is his master. God has given him a specific role to fulfill. God is the head of the state through Christ, that Christ is the head of all things. All right, Ephesians 1. Right? So we read these things and we have to recognize that if we're going to have a Christian political philosophy, right, different spheres established by God, and God is the head of everyone equally. Christians normally don't have a problem saying that God or Christ is head of the church or even head of the family, but then we get to the state and we lose our nerve. But Revelation 1:5 teaches this very, very clearly, that God or that Christ is the ruler of the kings on the earth. He will be, but he is right now. He is the head, yes, even of the state. He is the head of all things because he is the creator and redeemer of all things. So a Christian philosophy of government has to recognize that God is over the state. Third, we have to adopt the biblical language here that the church or the state and governing officials are the minister or the servant of God, depending on which translation you want to use from Romans 13, the minister, the deacon, the servant of God. And this means that the state can either be a faithful servant that recognizes its master God, or it can be an unfaithful servant that is rebelling against the authority that is above it, the authority that God has given it and executes over it. And so this is where we get the idea of that the state is to be sanctified. It is to be set aside in service unto God. All throughout the Bible, we have inanimate objects like utensils in the temple, or individuals referred to as being sanctified or consecrated unto the Lord. So what should Christians think about the state? What should the state be? Well, it should be a sanctified state. It should be set aside to service to its master. And in serving its master God, it actually is then serving the people. And we still have some of that language hanging around the Western tradition today. We have, outside of America, we have prime ministers, where we're getting the terminology of rulers of being ministers. We get it from Romans 13. It's a part of the biblical tradition of governance. Right? We refer to it here in the States, or at least we used to, as public servants. Where are we getting that from? Romans 13, that they are servants of God, that God has given them a specific ministry to do, and that ministry, God delegates them the authority for that ministry, no more and no less, and then they are to faithfully execute that ministry unto the Lord and for the good of its citizens. And so that's point number 3, in a nutshell. As a servant, it is to be serving God, serving neighbor, and that makes it a sanctified state. It is doing its ministry, its God-ordained function in society. Fourth, the main ministry as a servant of God of the state is to execute justice. Romans 13 tells us quite plainly that God has established the state to be his avenger on evildoers. That the primary function, the primary role of the state in society is not education. It's not redistributing wealth. It's not any of those things that we often think about big government today. The main function of the state is limited, that it is to enforce justice. It is to be God's instrument of wrath upon the evildoer. And this is why Christians should have no fear of the state, because if the Christian is living as a Christian, it should never run into problems with the state. Now, of course, as we've talked about elsewhere, the state sometimes acts as if it is a god, and it really becomes beastly and rebellious in an unsanctified state. But the main ministry of the state is to execute God's justice. And this is where we have to recognize this clear distinction. Right? Justice, enforcing what is right, punishing what is wrong, is a form of morality and ethics. This can never be divorced from religion. This can never not have a religious foundation. The state cannot function by determining what is right and wrong on its own. It needs a moral, philosophical foundation for ethics and morality. And that is provided by the Christian faith. And so when you read Romans 13 and you see things like, hey, he's God's minister, God's servant to punish evildoers. Well, what is it doing? It's really protecting life, liberty, and property from threats within and without. Christianity has remade governments before, and it can do it again. If we look back at Western history, and there's many works that have traced this out, that wherever Christianity has spread it, particularly Protestant Christianity, the size and the influence of government has shrunk. Personal liberties have grown. Prosperity has grown. Where Christian ethics and political philosophy have taken root, man has prospered and the state has shrunk. As secularism has grown, right, the shackles of the state have come off of it. It has grown as well, and liberty has shrunk. if we want to have a sanctified state, a limited state, a state that only does its role, that is not trying to play God, that is not trying to invade all of life, then you need to have the Christian foundation for it. World history teaches us that. Where particularly Protestant and Calvinistic Christianity took root, the state shrunk into its proper God-ordained sphere. Where that has been rejected, tyranny follows. The state grows. And so that's the path that's set before us. As we apply the Christian worldview into all of life, particularly into the realm of the state, we can see with no hesitation whatsoever, you can check out many different resources if you want to. Right? Tom Holland's Dominion is a great book. Stephen Smith's book, Pagans and Christians in the City. You can look at Vishal Mangawaldi's works. All right, Francis Schaeffer's work. All of these works point to this reality throughout history that cannot be denied. Where Protestant Christianity took root as the governing philosophy, man prospered. The government shrank, freedoms abounded. When we get rid of that, freedoms go away. We need to look no further than the French Revolution compared to the American Revolution. One ended in the Reign of Terror and the rise of Napoleon. The other has been, at least for hundreds of years, growing in freedom. Now it's shrinking because of secularism, but Christianity can renew that. But Christians have to get out of their mind that Christianity has to keep its hands off the state. The state needs to keep its hands off of Christianity. It needs to submit to its master, God, through Christ. All right, we're going to move on to a new topic in our next episode, but I hope you've benefited from this introduction to how the Christian faith and the Christian worldview informs how we should think about the realm of politics and state governance.